Welcome to the Midnight Jacket tutorial. I'm a firm believer that a motorcycle jacket is a staple in any wardrobe simply because the shape is so flattering and it can be made out of so many fabrics that completely change the vibe of the jacket. You can use a denim like I did for this jacket. I also chose to bleach dye it, which made this very special. You can use leather, faux leather, vinyls, brocades, or any fabric that has a sturdy hand to it. This jacket can handle a little bit of a heavier fabric, especially with the metal zippers. There are two views for this jacket. View A is the more unisex version and also the version that I'm creating for myself in this tutorial, and View B has a peplum where the waistband is on the other view. I will be teaching you guys how to assemble View B in this video also. There are quite a few pattern pieces to this specific pattern, but don't get overwhelmed with that. We've added some seams for aesthetics in here that just allow you to have some cool color blocking if you want to, so that explains the amount of pieces. Let's go ahead and begin by familiarizing ourselves with all of them. A is the collar, B is the undercollar, C is the front, D is the front shoulder yoke, E is the side front, F is the front waistband for View A only, G is the belt loop tab, H is the sleeve cap inset, I is the front sleeve, J is the middle sleeve, K is the back sleeve, L is the cuff, M is the back cuff, N is the cuff facing, O is the back cuff facing, P is the back shoulder yoke, Q is the back yoke, R is the side back, S is the back, T is the back waistband for View A only, U is the front peplum for View B only, V is the side seam pocket for View B only, W is the back peplum, X is the side front lining, Y is the back lining, ZA is the sleeve lining, ZB is the back sleeve lining, ZC is the chest pocket bag, ZD is the lower pocket bag, ZE is the inner pocket welt, and ZF is the inner pocket bag. Let's begin by constructing the back of the jacket. Let's start by stitching the center back seam of our back piece, which is piece S, and after stitching, you're going to press those seams open flat and beautiful. You'll now stitch the side back pieces, which is piece R, to the jacket back, making sure to match the notches. The next step is to stitch the center back yoke, which is piece Q, together at the center back seam. Afterwards, you're going to press that open. Now we can attach the back shoulder yoke, which is piece P, to the back yoke. If you notice there are notches and dots to help you match up the yokes, you need to use a good amount of pins to ease the yoke into the insert. Take your time with this. Sometimes I find that it's easier to pin on each side of it and kind of work my way to the middle, and depending on the fabric, if it's got a little stretch, I can kind of work it as I go. Now I'm going to start stitching it in place. It's really important that you kind of feel the fabric on the bottom as well as on the top to make sure that nothing is getting kind of pinched in there. This can be a tricky part, but just kind of feel it as you go, and then, check your progress as you go also. You may have to rip the seam a couple times, and if you do, that's perfectly okay. After stitching, you can then clip the notches into that curved seam, which will allow you to press it nice and flat. You can also trim away a bit of the seam allowance to do so if you think it feels bulky. Because I'm using like a genuine leather at the shoulder yokes, I'm going to use a pressing cloth to kind of press it. Definitely breaks the leather rules a little bit, but this isn't a leather tutorial. This is just me kind of showing you guys how to go about this, but a pressing cloth is not a bad idea if you're using a vinyl as well. After you finish one side, you will then repeat this step to the other. The next step is to attach the back yoke to the back of the jacket. So you're just going to line that up across the top, pin it in place, and then stitch. Afterwards, press it open flat and beautiful. Now let's take a second to assemble the belt loop tabs. The belt loop tabs are more for decor than anything, and they are optional. If you don't have the hardware kits to make them happen, or you don't feel like going to Joann to get them, you don't feel like attaching them, you can choose not to use them. You should have cut 8 of them, and when we sew them together, it will make 4. You're going to pin the right sides together and then sew them together, leaving the bottom open. Before I turn the right side out, I like to trim off all of the seam allowances so that I have a really nice clean point once I turn them. After clipping, I'm then going to use a turner to push them inside out. I'm using the end of a paintbrush. You can use whatever you've got. If you've got the proper tool, that's also going to be amazing for you, but I never do. I end up losing them. So use whatever you've got. Just don't puncture the end of it as you turn it right side out. After turning right side out, you're then going to press it nice and flat and then top stitch around the edges. If you're making View A, you will attach the bottom waistband, which is piece T, to the waist seam of the jacket back. If you are making view B, you will need to assemble the back peplum, which is piece W, by sewing the center back seam of the back peplum. After stitching and pressing, you will need to pin your belt loop tabs to the jacket waist seam where the notches indicate for the belt loop tabs to go. After pinning the belt loop tabs in place, you will attach the back peplum to the jacket back at the waist seam. Let's move on to the jacket front. Before we work on assembling, please take note that there is a cut line on piece C at the bottom for view A or view B. You're going to cut piece C according to which view of the jacket that you are going to be creating. Now let's work on creating the jacket front, which utilizes pieces C, D, E, and F. Let's begin by attaching the front shoulder yokes, which is piece D, to the side front jacket piece. Pin the yoke in and then stitch. Afterwards, we're going to clip the curve and then press that flat and beautiful, and then repeat this on the opposite side. We're going to treat this the same way that we did on the back yokes. If you are making view A, you will attach the front waistband, which is piece F, to the side front jacket at the waist seam. With the right sides facing, pin and then stitch, and repeat on the opposite side also. If you are making view B, you will want to pin the belt loop tabs to the waist seam at the front where they are marked on the pattern. After you've pinned the belt loop tabs to the front, you will attach the peplum front at the waist seam of the side front jacket. Now let's work on adding the pocket zippers and the linings. There are little rectangle boxes marked for the pockets with envelope-style markings in the center of those boxes. So let's mark this on the back side of the front jacket. I'm going to use a tailor's chalk that disappears with some steam. You can also use a tracing paper and a tracing wheel if you like. I'm marking the back because I'm going to be adding a small piece of fusible interfacing to the back of this. This is going to help hold the shape of the rectangle after we've sewn it and clipped it. After adding the fusible to the back, I will be marking the front of the side front piece in the same exact position. I'm going to lay my pattern piece over my fabric that I cut out and then trace those little envelope lines again, making sure that everything is lined up appropriately. After tracing, I will carefully snip the envelope shape using my shears. Now that we have cut the openings, we can attach our zippers. If you don't have zippers that are the exact length, you can adjust the length of the metal zippers by removing some of the teeth and then adjusting where the stoppers lay. If you need a tutorial, I did demonstrate this on the Patreon on a live a few months ago, and that still lives on the Patreon for everyone to see. Now that my zippers are the correct length, I'm going to attach them to the openings. To do so, I will carefully line my zippers up and then fold my seam allowance to face the zippers matching the right sides. I'm then going to pin them in. Place and sew one side first. For this, I'm going to be using a narrow zipper foot and then getting the foot close but not directly onto the teeth of the zipper. After sewing one side, I will line up the other side also, and then pin and sew. Now we are going to pull the top and the bottom parts of the envelope cut that we had made back onto the zipper tape and then pin them into place. Once we have pinned the tops and the bottoms, we are then going to stitch those. This will create that nice rectangle shape for the zipper to show on the front of the jacket. Definitely check it as you go. This is what's going to help it look really clean for you. After you have sewn the one zipper in, you can choose to top stitch around the edges if you want to. I chose not to with this jacket because I feel like it's going to be super clean anyway. And after you have done the one zipper, you are going to do the rest of the zippers. There are 4 on the front of the jacket. So just make your way around and do the top and the bottom zippers on the side front. Repeat these steps and take your time with them so that they're nice and clean. And then when you're finished, you will have 4 of the zippers that are ready to attach the pocket bags. Now let's add our lower pocket bag, which is piece ZD, to the lower pocket. To do this, we will mark on the back of the pocket bag with chalk just like we did to the side front. We will also add a small rectangle of interfacing to the back of the pocket bag. Now we can flip the pocket bag over and draw the envelope lines to the front. After drawing, we can then carefully cut those envelope lines out. Flip the side front jacket piece so the face is facing downward and lay the pocket bag over the zipper with the right side facing you. Now you will attach this pocket bag just like we did the zipper by attaching one side at a time and working your way around the rectangle starting with the 2 longer sides. You're going to be attaching them to the seam allowance of the zipper tape and the actual outer fabric. As I'm sewing this to the actual zipper tape and the seam allowance of the side front, I'm actually going to keep it close, but I don't want to let it get super close. There wants to be a little bit of wiggle room here. This is the inside of the pocket. You're not really going to see it, although you do want it to be super clean. So make sure that your lines are straight, make sure that your seam allowance is where it's supposed to be, but keep an eye on how close it is to the actual zipper. I finished up one side and now I'm going to work on the other one. So I'm just going to flip the pocket over so I can line up those seam allowances there, pin those in place, and then I will stitch that just like I did the other side. After I have worked on both sides, I can then pull the ends underneath, and then I can sew the top and the bottom to the seam allowance also. It's easier if you pull the pocket away and then you kind of line up where that's going to lay. Just pop a little pin in there if you need to. I kind of wing it, so if you're not very familiar with doing it, don't do a gunner here. Definitely use pins. But as you can see, this is what I'm going to be sewing together. It's all those little layers there. After you have sewn all 4 sides, you can press. Now we are going to stitch around the edges of the pocket bag. Make sure the bag is facing the right direction to where your hand will enter the pocket. Then you're going to fold the bag in that direction in half and then pin all the way around the edges and then stitch. I'm going to overlock around the edges of mine to make sure that it's nice and secure because I want my pockets to be able to hold all my things. You will After you finished up this pocket bag on the bottom, you're then going to do the opposite side of the jacket. Now let's work on the chest pocket bag, which is piece C. They're going to be attached to the top zippers of the side front. Much like the bottom, we will be repeating the steps of marking the envelope cutout, adding the fusible, and attaching to the back of the zipper. When you are going to fold the pocket bag to close it up, make sure that it is facing the way your hand will enter, just like the bottom of the bag. And in place, you're going to stitch all around the edges, and then you're going to either overlock or zigzag them so that they are nice and secure. Then we will repeat this step to the other side of the side front jacket, and then all 4 of our zippers will have the pocket bags attached to them and are ready to use as functional zippers. Now let's attach our jacket front piece, which is C, to the side front. Please keep in mind that you will be sewing half of your metal zipper for the front into one of these seams, and which side you sew the zipper into determines which side of the zipper your jacket's going to zip up on, if that matters to you. Once you've decided which side of the zipper you're going to sew in, you're going to pin that zipper into the side front and the front seam with your zipper teeth pointed inwards, and you're going to leave yourself about 1/2 inch from the bottom seam allowance to where your zipper starts. Sandwich your zipper between the side front and the front pieces, and then stitch the front/side front together. If you're using a narrow zipper foot like I am, it's really easy to get very close to the metal teeth, but please keep in mind that when you do that, a metal zipper has a wider zipper pull, and so sometimes it tends to get stuck on the fabric if it's too close. So you want to make sure that you give yourself a little bit of wiggle room in there with that. One of my biggest things that I always tell everyone is to press everything, and that absolutely applies to metal zippers. I want you to see the difference between what it looks like now versus after I press it. The metal zipper will actually lay flat. It really helps to relax the zipper tape. Sometimes the zippers get put into like questionable situations and positions, and so they don't always lay flat, but I promise you, like a little bit of steam and an iron will really make a zipper look so professional. As you can see here, we've got the zipper sewn into the side front seam on one side, and so the other half of the zipper will get sewn into the front here, and that way when you're actually wearing it, it crosses over like a motorcycle jacket, they get zipped up beautifully. Let's create our sleeves. I'm going to start with the top portion of the sleeve, so let's attach the sleeve yoke, which is piece H, to the middle sleeve, which is piece J. Pin the yoke to the curved opening at the top with the right sides facing, and then stitch the yoke into the sleeve, just like we did on the back yokes. Afterwards, you're going to clip the curves and trim away the excess. Please note that there are these little dots that help you line up all the pattern pieces so that you know where things should fit in, and the notches should also line up. Now let's attach the sleeve back to the middle sleeve. Match the notches and then pin the right sides facing. After pinning, you're going to stitch that in place and press the seams open flat and beautiful. Now we can attach the sleeve front to the middle sleeve. Match those notches, pin, and then stitch together. Before we can sew the cuff to the back cuff, we need to insert a zipper into the seam. Technically, this is optional, and if you choose not to, you will just sew the seam closed from where the zipper should go, but if you are inserting a zipper, now is when you would do so. You want to make sure that your zipper tape is 1/2 inch longer than where the teeth stop and start. The tape is what the teeth are attached to. If your zipper length matches the cuff measurement, you won't have to adjust anything. Start by sewing 1/2 of your zipper to one side of your cuff, and the other side of the zipper to the back cuff. After stitching, you will want to press the seam nice and flat. If you're using a leather, that might be a little tricky. If you do, just use a pressing cloth. We can now attach the cuff to the top of the sleeve. Make sure to match the notch of the cuff at the top to where the seam of the middle and the front sleeve meet. This will ensure your zipper is on the cuff and aligns with the right side of the arm. Afterwards, we can sew the inseam of the sleeve. You're going to pin the right sides facing and then stitch, and afterwards you're going to press. Sleeves can be a little tricky to press, so using an ironing ham like this one that I got at Joann can be super helpful. Now we can sit our sleeves aside. Now let's assemble our collar. For the collar, we will be pinning the under collar, which is piece B, to the collar, which is piece A. With the right sides facing, you're going to pin and then stitch around the edges, making sure to leave the bottom open. Please note that the seam allowance for this is 3/8 of an inch, rather than the 1/2 of an inch on the rest of the pattern. After stitching, you are going to clip the corners and then turn the collar right side out. Make sure that you press those points of the collar out so they are nice and pointed. This is a major focal point of the jacket. You want it to look really nice and crisp. And once your collar has been pressed, you can then set it aside. We'll get back to this here in a moment. We have now assembled all of the pieces to make the outer shell of the jacket and can begin assembling the actual shell. Let's start by pinning the shoulder seams at the front and the back of the jacket. With the right sides facing, you will stitch the shoulder seams and then press them open. For view A, we can now stitch the side seams of the front and the back of the jacket. With the right sides facing, you're going to pin and stitch the side seams of the jacket and afterwards press them open. For view B, there is an optional side pocket that we'll have to sew into the side seam of the peplum. It's marked pocket opening on the peplum. You will stitch and pin from the armpit all the way down to the first notch, and then from that bottom notch all the way down to the bottom of the peplum, leaving an opening for the pocket. The next step will be to stitch the side seam pocket, which is piece V, to the seam allowance of the pocket opening. I'm going to be sewing one side of the pocket at a time, and then we'll join the two layers at the end. I'm matching up my pocket to the pocket opening and checking my notches, making sure everything is lined up perfectly, and then afterwards I will pin everything in place. Then I'm going to start stitching where I left off stitching at the pocket opening and stopping where we stopped stitching the pocket opening. Get these stitches as close as possible to the original stopping points. It should look like one solid line when you're finished. And now we're going to repeat this on the other half of the pocket. Afterward, we will join the two pockets by sewing around the edges of the pockets, and then press everything nice and flat. This allows you to check your work, and you'll also get a good idea of how things are going to lay at this point. It should lay very flat and very beautiful. At the end, I will add a little stitch to secure the pocket to the peplum waist seam. Now that the side seams are sewn no matter which view you are making, let's insert the sleeve into the armhole. You want to match the notches and make sure that you match the right sides of the fabric. Use as many pins as you can so that you can make sure that the sleeve fits properly into the opening. After pinning, you're going to stitch the sleeve into the arm opening. After stitching, you will want to clip the curves and press as best as possible. If you plan on using a shoulder pad, now is when you would attach that. I like to add a little whip stitch around my shoulder pad just to attach it to the seam allowance of the armhole at the top. I make sure that the shoulder pad is lined up perfectly to the cap of the shoulder, and I stitch that into place. This step is not necessary if you aren't a fan of shoulder pads. I like a little drama, so I'm going to use it. Now you're going to stitch the outer sleeve in, and then sit the shell of the jacket aside. Let's start assembling the lining of the jacket. Let's begin by adding the pocket to the front lining, which is piece X. This step is unnecessary, but I like to include this pocket because if I have something valuable on me, this is traditionally where I like to put it. To begin, much like the zipper part of the process, you will mark the front and the back where the envelope lines are on the side front lining. Now let's iron some feasible interfacing to the back where the welt will go. You can now flip the side front over and carefully cut out the envelope style lines where the welt will be. From here, I like to carefully fold under the flaps of the opening, pin them down, and then iron them so that they stay where I want them to be. This will give a really nice rectangle and a good base for us to work with. Now I'm going to fold my actual welt in half and then either overlock or zigzag around the edges. And now I'm going to insert the welt behind the opening and line it up so that it's central and pin it in place. The finished edge of the welt should actually line up with the finished edge of the welt opening. You want to be able to slide your hand in here. You'll also be able to feel where the welt is central in the opening so that there's the seam allowance on both sides and below. And once you do, just make sure that you pin everything really closely. Now that everything is pinned in place, I will then top stitch around the outside edges of the rectangle. This is going to secure the welt in the center of the opening and also secure the seam. Now that we have secured the welt opening, we can attach the inner pocket bag, which is piece ZF, to the back of the welt. We will treat this exactly like we did with the back of the zippers by marking, using an interfacing on the back, and then lining up over the back of the welt, and turning the seam allowance under to match up and pinning and stitching. After you have worked your way around the rectangle and all 4 sides of the pocket lining are stitched to the seam allowance of the jacket lining, you will then close the inner pocket lining up by folding it in half and then stitching around the edges. After stitching, you can overlock and zigzag around the edges to make it more secure. If you're making view A, you will attach the front waistband, which is piece F, to the waistband seam of the side front lining. We're basically mimicking the outside of the jacket here. If you are making view B, you will need to attach the front peplum lining, which is piece U, to the waist of the front side lining. Now we can work on the back lining. Begin by sewing the center back of the lining piece, which is piece Y. After pinning and stitching with the right sides facing, you will then press the seam open. Please note that there are darts on each side of the center back lining pieces. Make sure that you stitch those darts. Depending on whether you are making view A or view B, you will attach the back waistband or the back peplum lining. If you are using the peplum, you will need to stitch the center back peplum lining, piece W, before attaching at the waist seam of the back lining. The next step is to attach the shoulder seams of the lining front and the lining back. We will also be attaching the side seams. With the right sides facing, pin and stitch the shoulders and the side seams of the lining. Afterwards, press open flat and beautiful. Lastly, let's attach our front facing to the side front lining. With the right sides facing, you're going to pin and stitch the facing to the lining. The next step is to create our sleeve lining. You should have cut 2 of the back cuff lining and 2 of the cuff lining. We will now be sewing the cuff facings onto the cuff linings. These will sit directly onto the sleeve and will be visible. This step isn't necessary, but I think it makes a big difference in the overall look and aesthetic of the sleeve. To start, you will want to finish out the top edge of the cuff facings because they're going to be visible from the inside. I'm choosing to overlock mine, but you could do a zigzag stitch, or you could even iron 1/2 of an inch seam allowance down to the back side of the facing, just something to finish out that top edge. Now we will stitch the facings to the bottom of the cuff and the cuff lining, so all the way around the outside edges. I'm doing this at 1/4 of an inch so that none of my stitching will be noticeable once we sew the rest of our usual 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to stitch the sleeve lining, piece ZA, to the back sleeve lining, which is piece ZB. After stitching, I'll press those open. I will now attach the cuff lining and the back cuff lining, and I'm only going to stitch down about 1/2 of an inch from the top towards the bottom. We're going to need to attach the sleeve lining to the sleeve, and in order to do so, the zipper is there, so we are going to be leaving this open for now, but we just need that little 1/2 an inch at the top to be able to sew it to the sleeve lining. With right sides facing, you're going to pin and stitch the cuff lining to the sleeve lining. Afterwards, you're going to press that open. We can now stitch the inseam of the sleeve lining. Pin the right sides together and stitch and press. A big thing to remember when pinning the sleeve in is that you want the back of the sleeve to match up with the back of the jacket. And we want this because the zipper is still going to be at the bottom, and so we left that part of the bottom of the lining open so we can attach it to the zipper, and you want to make sure that they're on the same side. So I always kind of make sure that the back of the jacket and the back of the sleeve match up, and then I start pinning it around the armhole. I use a lot of pins here because it's really important to kind of negotiate the curves. Curves can be very tricky, but as long as you take your time and you really kind of pin everything in place, you'll be totally fine. Once you've got everything pinned, then you're going to stitch all the way around that sleeve cap. As usual, I'm going to clip the curves, and then I'm going to overlock the edges, finish out that seam. This is a part of the jacket that's going to get a lot of movement and a lot of wear and tear, so you want to make sure that that's a very strong seam. Our jacket lining is now ready to sew into the shell of the jacket, so let's set it aside for a moment. Before we attach the lining to the shell, let's pin the collar into the neck. Mark your center of the collar and align it with the center back of the jacket. With the collar facing downwards towards the jacket, pin all the way along the top. If you are making view A, you will also pin in your belt loop tabs to the bottom. They will also face inwards towards the jacket. Now let's pin our lining to the jacket shell. Start with the center back seam and work your way around the top. Before you pin the center front, you will need to pin the zipper into the other side of the jacket, opposite of where you sewed the other half of that zipper. You want the teeth to face inward, so pin within that in mind. Also, start your zipper the same length from the bottom as you started your other zipper, about 1/2 inch for mine. So when I'm pinning, my sleeves are actually pulled downwards into the jacket on both the lining and the outer shell, so they're out of the way. And what we're doing is we're joining the jacket and the lining all the way around the outside edges. I am going to leave a gap at the bottom of it, about 10 to 12 inches wide. We'll close it up later, but that's going to allow us to fix the sleeves and turn the jacket right side out. But as you're pinning, go all the way around the jacket. You are going to have some really nice points and corners in there, so keep that in mind. Just use a lot of pins. It'll help you keep everything really organized. Now we're going to stitch from that opening that I told you to leave at the bottom waistband, that 10 to 12 inches. Or in the peplum bottom, either one, whether you're doing view A or view B, you're going to have an opening. So we're going to stitch from one side all the way around the front neckline and down the other side to the waistband, the bottom, or the peplum bottom, whichever one you're doing. Just you want to sew all the way around the outside edges of the jacket at your 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure to leave that opening at the bottom big enough to work with. After stitching, you will need to clip the corners of the collar, and then when you're turning it right side out, you want to press all of those points out nice and pointed. Make sure that you press everything with an iron when you're done. This is super important. This is like the main part of the jacket. This is what makes your jacket look so professional. I promise you that pressing everything, I know I keep telling you, but it is definitely the way to go. Now that our garment is right side out, you need to pull the ends of the sleeves and the sleeve linings down through the bottom opening because we're going to be attaching them. We're going to be sewing the sleeve lining to the sleeve with the right sides facing. Now, we need to start by having one side of the zipper and pinning the lining to the seam allowance of the zipper and the zipper tape. We're going to work our way up to the end of the sleeve, all the way across, and then back down to the other side of the zipper. As you can see here, I'm also using my narrow zipper foot again, and I'm getting pretty close to the seam allowance without being right on top of it. I want to have maybe like 1/8 of an inch in between the two, but I'm going to sew all the way up one side of the zipper, and then I will end up sewing all the way across the end of the sleeve, and then all the way back down to the other side of the zipper. What this is going to do is it's going to like make the zipper and the lining look like they were meant for each other, because they are, and it's going to allow the zipper to be functional once we turn the sleeve right side out. My biggest bit of advice here is to make sure that your sleeves are not twisted. You don't want them to be like weird when you try to pull them through. You will instantly know once you've done this and you pull your sleeve right side out whether or not you've done it correctly, so take the time to make sure that things are lined up. After you have stitched the lining to the sleeve seam allowance, you are going to clip the edges because when you pull this right side out, you want this to be nice and pointed and beautiful. Once you have sewn both sleeve linings to the sleeves, you can then pull them right side out. We should now be left with the opening at the bottom of the waistband or the peplum. You're going to carefully pin and hand stitch the opening closed, and then afterwards press it nice and flat. Now would be the time to top stitch around the entire coat. I highly suggest doing this. I think it's what makes it really professional, but let me tell you, you have to take your time. You have to watch how close your presser foot is to the edge of it. You want this line to be very straight and very clean. Usually this is how I know the difference between something that's handmade and professional is by the top stitch, so take your time. You want to impress people with your new coat. The very last step is to add the hardware to the lapel and the collar and the belt loop tabs of the jacket. If you wanted to cheat, you could always just sew buttons there, but I love the snaps. I think that they're so much fun. You can also buy these kits at Joann or Wawak.com. That's WAWAK.com. They ship out pretty fast also. But I also think that it just adds a little bit of metal to the jacket that makes it feel professional and polished and expensive. If you guys make a version of this jacket, please tag me in this. I have plans on making this jacket in like 3 or 4 different kinds of fabrics. I just think a motorcycle jacket makes you look so cool, and I can't wait to see the way that you guys interpret this and make it your own.